This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Hello and welcome back. My name's Helen Collis. I'm a journalist covering healthcare at POLITICO in Europe. I'm now joined on the stage by Kris Sterkens, Company Group Chair of Janssen EMEA and Managing Director of Janssen Pharmaceuticals, for a discussion on some of the macroeconomic pressures the company is currently facing. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. You can ask questions through the swap card platform if we have time. It is only 10 minutes, so we may not have time on this session. And if you are tweeting, the hashtag is Politico Healthcare. Kris, welcome.
Hi, good morning.
So before the break, we heard about the big ambitions of the EU to do better next time in ensuring a more equitable response globally in the next health crisis. Janssen, part of the Johnson & Johnson group, was involved in a successful development of a COVID-19 vaccine in the pandemic. But what did the company learn during this process in trying to ensure citizens around the world are fairly protected against the coronavirus?
Yeah, you know how they say that don't waste a good crisis, and I think what we definitely did learn is that things that used to take a lot of time when it comes to the development or bringing medicines to patients during the pandemic, I think there was an incredible focus on getting a vaccine to the population, and the level of collaboration and the reduction that we saw in bureaucracy in getting things done was amazing. Everybody was aligned at that one purpose, and I think we generally have that purpose, but it became so crystal clear during that time that we all had to work together, and I think that actually led to result development, not just ours, but several vaccines coming to the population, making sure that this pandemic, as we experience now, is under control. So that to me was an incredible learning, and one of the things that we said as a company is how can we actually institutionalize that so that when the next one comes, and hope that never does, but AMR is potentially a threat there, are there things that we can now institutionalize that we can keep? And we have, of course, the Health Emergency and Rapid Response Agency established, so that is great. I think we need to hold on to that. My concern, if you allow me, is we went from one crisis to the other one. We have the macroeconomic crisis, the Ukraine-Russia war, inflation, rising energy costs. And you see that shift of governments sometimes forgetting everything that went so well and that we worked out and that we actually should hold on to and reprioritize. And while I understand that, it's a pity that some of the great things when it comes to healthcare are now being challenged again or even put back on the agenda. So that is probably a rude awakening as well.
So you say multiple actors coming together in the pandemic really helped to shine a light on how to work effectively in a crisis situation. How can we use this blueprint in other scenarios going forwards? How can we hold on to that?
Well, I think one of the mindset is, you know, everyone, certainly also a pharmaceutical company, we build everything just in time, maximum efficiency. And I think what we certainly saw is that systems that are built for maximum efficiency are really vulnerable in time of crisis. So from just in time to just in case. And that's what I mean with making sure we hold on to that preparedness, making sure that countries, authorities, everyone, stakeholders continue to see that healthcare is an investment and not a cost. And I think if you are prepared, you actually are going to be much more efficient in managing that as well, because the most expensive way of dealing with something is if you're not prepared and if you have to act ad hoc and so on. I mean, pandemics by nature are unpredictable, are dynamic. So preparedness is the way forward to make sure that the next time you are more efficient, you're more rapid, and you get things better under control. And again, that's, I think, the concern is that we lose sight of that again.
So the risks of turning away from healthcare now, and we were seeing governments redirecting some of that public spending towards things like defense and security. Is that a big concern for you?
It is a very big concern. And while I understand that, I mean, obviously there's another crisis, governments have the obligation to deal with that. But if I see, just to take, for example, Germany, which I think was a very well-working ecosystem with the AMNOG process, the fact that we are now sacrificing that kind of bringing innovation rapidly to patients, which is a structural setup for what I still hope is a relatively short-term crisis, that to me is very concerning and, to be honest, incomprehensible.
And what do you think the EU's response here in healthcare is? I mean, we've obviously got the HERA authority established through the pandemic, but is there a risk with these added pressures that Europe might, and the Commission and EU countries might lose interest in continuing to invest in the development of that authority? Well,
I think the EU has the right agenda. I mean, one of the things that the EU is working on pharmaceutical legislation, one of the things they are working on is a European-wide or an EU-wide health technology assessment body. And while that makes sense, we have to make sure that if that establishes, I mean, it's better to do things once than to do them 27 times over. But we have to make sure that what comes out is actually at the benefit of getting innovation and medicines rapidly to patients. And you know, if you look at access to patients, it goes from, as it used to be in Germany, from day one versus an average of over 400 days in other countries. Obviously, if the EU will come up with something, I'd rather have it on the shorter time than on the longer term. So the agenda is right, but the devil is in the details. So I think getting access to patients, having innovation top of mind is still there, but how is it going to be worked out? And obviously, we hope that can be done with all the stakeholders, including pharmaceutical industry, around the table.
And you did say the devil is in the details, and just to push on some of those details on the EU HTA process, what's your response? Are you familiar with how the methodology's been developed over the last year?
Well, we're trying to...
Are you happy with how it's looking at the moment?
I'm happy with the concept. I think the process of getting there usually takes a lot of back and forth. I think the good thing is that the right stakeholders are around the table, but I do believe that none of us should fall back on dogmatic ways of looking at it, and that we really have to be pragmatic and try to see eventually the need. It's a common objective, just like we had with the pandemic. How can we get innovative medicines to patients faster and more equitable around the EU?
Our next panel is going to discuss antimicrobial resistance and the big challenges in that field. Do you think there are lessons that can be taken from the pandemic to try and solve some of those big challenges, from testing, diagnostics, R&D, clinical trials? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, AMR has proven to be too big of a challenge for a single company, if I'm talking for my industry. So I think the idea of, first of all, as an industry to work together as an alliance is great, but it cannot stop there. Again, I think if you talk about lessons learned, the COVID-19 pandemic showed us if you are working together, and if we can put that in, like you said, HERA is a great example of that. If we can institutionalize, we're going to be better prepared. Again, my concern is let's not forget all the lessons that we learned. But I think preparedness is probably the biggest thing that we can do. Now, the other thing is it comes to incentives. There's often the discussion that developing a new antibiotic, there's no incentive for a pharmaceutical company because the innovation is not rewarded as such. I think if we can think about the right incentives, push and pull incentives to make that happen, I think we would see a lot more progress. One of the things I really like, for example, is the US model where you can get what they call a priority voucher if you develop a medicine for which maybe the financial return is not there, but you can get a voucher when you do that, and you can use it for a commercial big potential product and say, I want an accelerated review. So you can use that voucher for that. That kind of a mechanism, these kinds of out-of-the-box solutions is one example of how we can incentivize working towards that.
You've touched on some topics I'm going to be talking about in the next panel, but
Okay.
we are reaching the limit of our time here this morning. Thank you, Kris, so much for joining me on the stage today. I think you've presented some really interesting arguments here about the pressures of the current economic climate on the pharmaceutical sector at the moment, but some lessons that can be drawn potentially from actors all working together, as we saw in the pandemic, to solve some of these big challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We now move to a panel discussion on antimicrobial resistance, looking at whether Europe can get ahead of the deadly antimicrobial curve. So please stay seated whilst we bring the panelists onto the stage. Thank you.